So we just learned what child-to-parent communication means, and so let's now do some more of it in order to delete items from our list. So the idea here is that whenever we click on one of these crosses here next to an item, it will then delete the item from the state and therefore from the user interface. Now, since this click here will happen inside the item component, so remember, each of them is actually an item component, and so the click to delete, so on each of these crosses, will happen inside of the item, but the state actually lives in the app, so in the parent component. And therefore, this is another case of child-to-parent communication. So let's now go back here to our app, which is where our state lives, and then all we're going to do is to create a new function right here called handle delete item. Now, in order to delete an item, we need to know which item it actually is that should be deleted. So in order to do that, so to tell this function which item it is, we will pass in the ID whenever we later call this function. So remember that each of these items here has an ID, and so we can then use that ID to remove the corresponding object from the items array. Now, about the delete operation itself, we will of course delete the item from the user interface by updating state. So we call setItems, and now here in setItems, we need the new array after the item has been deleted. Now, once again, this new items array will be based on the current one. And so we need a callback function which receives the current item as its input. And so now let's say items.filter, which will loop over the array, and in each iteration, it will get access to the items object. And so now, basically, all we want to do is to filter out the item that has the ID that we got here, right? So item.id is different from the ID, so the ID that we pass in. So whenever this condition here is true, the item will end up in the new array, so of the array of the items that have not been deleted. But when this is false, so when item.id is equal the ID, then that element will no longer be part of the final array. And so that's how we remove, so how we delete elements from arrays. And once again, if this is strange, please go back to the section where I review essential JavaScript concepts. So there I teach in detail about how this works. And now all we have to do is to call this function whenever the click here happens. So how do we get that there? Well, we now need to pass the function as a prop also into the packing list. So into the packing list because the items are called inside the packing list. So on delete item, and so I'm using the same naming convention as before, where I call the prop on delete item and then pass in the function handle delete item. And so now let's receive this prop here inside the packing list. So we already have items. So let's add this one here to the list. And again, this is so helpful because now we know immediately what props the packing list will receive. And then remember that the click actually happens here on this button. So inside the item component. And so here we also will need access to this prop. Therefore, we now need to pass it in along the item right here. So onDelete item equals onDelete item. And so we're basically passing now this prop through the packing list into the item. So it moves here from app to packing list and then to each of these items. So packing list itself doesn't really need it, but of course, this is the only place where we can receive it because we cannot pass it directly from app to item, right? So that would not be possible. Okay, and now here, we use the onClick prop and then we specify our handler function. Now, if we do just this, on delete item, then this is not going to work. So let's see why. So let's test this here. And so you see that nothing happens. So we can see that here also in app, when we try to log the ID. And so now you will see that, well, nothing happens. Because what we get in here instead of an ID is this event. So what's going on here? Well, when we simply specify the function here like this, then React will call the function as the event happens, and it does so by passing in the event object. So we actually used this to our advantage in the form. So right here, where we then received the event. But right now we do not want to receive the event, but instead the ID of the current item. And so we need to create a new function here, and then we pass in the current ID. So item.id. And once more, it's really important that you don't forget this, because otherwise React will just immediately call the function, which is not what we want. We want a function here really, so that React can then call this function only when the event happens. And this is actually it. So this should do the job. Let's see. And beautiful. So that's gone. You see here also the ID that we logged to the console. And so it was based on that ID that the new items array was set. So the state was updated, which forced React to re-render the component. Or in other words, to re-render the component's view. So to be a bit more specific. So let's try that again. And yeah, then we cleaned everything. Now, let's also, since we're already here, get rid of these initial items, because now we are getting this ESLint warning that this is never used. So again, really helpful here from ESLint. And yeah, just by the way, we could of course also have used these initial items here as our initial state. And so then whenever we would reload, well, not this. So whenever we would reload here, then we would get these three as a default. So they would then get added into our state, and then everything would work the same. So we could also delete them here. And as we reloaded, then they would be back. But that's not what we want. So let's just get rid of all this. Beautiful. And now all we have to do here for the final operation is to implement this functionality. So where we click here, and then it will mark the item as packed. So that's going to be our topic for the next lecture.